Sometimes, the hardest thing isn't being silenced. It's sitting in a room full of applause, knowing the truth you carry won't earn any of it. She walked into that hall knowing exactly what they'd see an outsider with a soft voice, too young to be taken seriously, too calm to be called powerful. Across from her sat a woman who had ruled courtrooms and television sets alike, with a legacy carved in stone and a tone that allowed no room for doubt. But that day wasn't about titles. It was about something far more difficult to name: the quiet war between what justice once looked like and what it needs to become. And somewhere between those two chairs, in the space between interruption and answer, something shifted. What happens when the voice they tried to dismiss becomes the one they can't unhear? Let me tell you what unfolded in that room. The air inside Constitution Hall held the weight of unspoken tension, the kind that lingers when two truths are about to collide. It was a crisp October morning in Philadelphia, the city of declarations and contradictions, and the wooden panels of the historic venue reflected more than just old speeches. They reflected expectation. The event was billed as a moment of national reckoning, the national dialogue on American justice. The screens read in calm serif font. Moderated by Harold Masters, a law professor from Georgetown known for his balance and sharp moderation, the town hall was meant to bridge generations of legal thought. On one side of the stage sat Judge Judy Sheindlin, the famously unflinching courtroom matriarch, a figure whose name had become synonymous with justice, served fast and unapologetically. At 81, her frame had shrunk, but her presence had not. Her reputation, decades of decisions, blunt language, and TV dominance had earned her reverence from Americans who believed justice needed to be stern to be real. And across from her sat Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. At 43, she was younger by nearly 4 decades, but her eyes held their own history, not the kind you read in law books, but the kind you inherit from communities forgotten by them. Crockett was no stranger to legal arenas before politics. She had spent years as a public defender in Dallas courtrooms, where worn-out mothers cried in fluorescent hallways and verdicts often arrived with more prejudice than precision. In Washington, she was gaining traction fast. A new voice, sharp but never shrill, relentless but rarely rattled. As the cameras began to roll, Harold introduced both guests with the caution of a man who knew exactly what kind of energy he was trying to balance. Polite applause rippled through the audience, but it wasn't until Judge Judy adjusted her blazer and crossed her legs that the crowd truly stirred. She still had that magnetism. It was the kind that made you want to straighten your back. Crockett, by contrast, sat still. Not stiff-still, poised. Her navy suit wasn't designer, but it fit like resolve. She nodded at the crowd but didn't wave. Her fingers traced the edge of a leather-bound notebook in her lap. She had nothing to prove, but she knew that didn't mean she wouldn't be tested. The push didn't come with words. It came when Judge Judy turned toward her, leaned slightly to the side, and offered a half-smile tight at the corners, almost reflexive. A look that said, "I've seen your type before." A look that carried the unspoken weight of assumptions, not about policy, but about personhood. The room didn't notice. The cameras didn't catch it. But Crockett did. Her smile didn't falter. She just lowered her gaze to her notes for a second longer than necessary, flipped one page, and returned the look with a neutrality that only the trained understand: measured, tempered, unreadable. The kind of look that says, "I've seen your type too, and I've survived every single one." It was a moment so subtle, most wouldn't name it. But for Black women in public life, especially in rooms built to celebrate older, louder legacies, that look is familiar. It's the "prove to me you belong here" gaze. The one delivered with charm and received with silence. It wasn't hateful. That would be easier. It was paternal, which is harder. Harold Masters moved to the first question, something measured and harmless. Let's begin by exploring the core values that have shaped each of your approaches to justice. Judge Sheindlin, perhaps you'd like to start? Judge Judy did not hesitate. Her voice filled the hall as if it had been waiting to echo in this space for decades. "Justice," she said, "is about accountability, period. We have a nation that's forgotten that actions have consequences. And for 30 years, I reminded people of that, whether they were rich or poor, black or white. I didn't ask what happened to them growing up. I asked what they did. It was the kind of opening statement only a legend could deliver, crisp, absolute, impossible to interrupt without seeming disrespectful. Harold turned to Crockett. "And, Congresswoman, your core?" Crockett inhaled softly through her nose and gave the briefest nod. "Justice," she began, "is about context. It's about asking why we keep seeing the same faces in our courtrooms, why we criminalize survival in some zip codes and excuse excess in others. I believe justice isn't real if it's only applied, not questioned." Her voice was lower, more measured, but it didn't need to rise. The truth had weight, and the room, perhaps for the first time, shifted slightly in their seats. Judge Judy didn't flinch, but her gaze sharpened. The smile was gone. Crockett continued, "We come from different systems. You presided, I defended, and those roles shape what we see." It wasn't a challenge. It was a boundary, one lined not with barbed words, but with the quiet steel of experience. Still, it landed like a pebble in still water. You couldn't unhear it. Harold, sensing the undercurrent, tried to pivot. "Let's talk sentencing reform." But the stage had already changed. It wasn't in what had been said. It was in what had been assumed. And Crockett had heard it all. The discussion shifted, but the undercurrent remained. It pulsed beneath every sentence, every smile, every moment of professional courtesy exchanged between the two women seated across from each other. On paper, they were equals, invited experts in a nationally televised conversation about justice. But in tone, in posture, in the way the audience's eyes lingered a little longer on Judge Judy when she spoke, it was clear. One was legacy, the other a guest in that legacy's house. Harold Masters introduced the next question, his voice a touch too neutral. "Sentencing disparities continue to shape public trust or distrust in our system. In light of that, what role should reform play in restoring balance?" Judge Judy leaned forward with the assuredness of someone used to being the final word. "You want to restore balance?" she asked, locking eyes with the crowd before glancing briefly at Crockett. "Start by telling people that crime has consequences. Not everything needs to be reformed. Sometimes people just need to follow the law." The room nodded, or rather, parts of it did. The older section former prosecutors, retired judges, law school alumni offered approving murmurs. It was familiar. It was safe. Crockett's fingers remained interlaced in her lap. She didn't blink, didn't shift, only spoke when it was truly time. "There's a difference," she said slowly, "between consequences and patterns." Judge Judy raised an eyebrow. Crockett continued, "A consequence implies justice is a straight line, but when the same communities are over-policed, overcharged, and over-sentenced, that's not a straight line. That's a loop." She paused, not for effect, but because that's what happens when you're used to being interrupted. You leave space. You wait to be challenged. Judy didn't jump in. So Crockett filled the quiet. "In Dallas County, where I practiced, I represented young men who were offered 20 years for a bag of weed. And I watched same week, same courthouse, a wealthy white college student get probation for selling ecstasy." She turned to the moderator. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I'm asking for honest arithmetic." Harold nodded, but it was Judge Judy who answered. "You're cherry-picking," she said, crossing her arms. "I sentenced all kinds of people. I didn't look at skin. I looked at behavior." The tone wasn't cruel. It was clipped, dismissive, like someone swatting away a mosquito they didn't think could sting. Crockett smiled again, the same small, unreadable smile from earlier. "That's the line, isn't it?" she said quietly. "I don't see color. I see behavior." Judy straightened in her chair. "Because that's what matters. What people do, not what they look like." Crockett nodded. "That sounds neutral. It even sounds fair." She looked directly at her. "But it assumes we all start from the same place, that we all get stopped for the same reasons, that our neighborhoods are policed the same way, that our schools are funded the same, that our parents weren't redlined out of opportunities before we were even born. The moderator didn't intervene. The room was still. Crockett's voice dropped slightly, intimate now. You ever tried defending someone who never had a chance to do anything but survive? Judy didn't respond. Crockett's voice stayed steady, but the story behind it began to rise. I remember a client 18 years old, arrested for stealing baby formula. No priors, no violence, just hunger. Her hands, still folded, began to tighten. He got 6 months because the judge said he needed to learn responsibility. She looked toward Judy, not angrily, but almost like someone trying to understand an old song's meaning. I wonder, she said gently, if you've ever looked into a young mother's face and had to explain why her son is going to jail for trying to feed her grandson. The pause that followed wasn't for drama. It was grief. Grief for all the stories no one clapped for. Judge Judy's voice returned, slower now. We can't excuse crime just because someone had a hard life. Crockett nodded. I agree. Then she leaned forward barely an inch, but it changed everything. I'm not excusing it. I'm explaining it. And if we don't explain it, we can't fix it. That sentence floated. It didn't strike. It sat in the middle of the room like a quiet guest no one knew how to address. Judy didn't respond immediately. For the first time, she looked unsure not of her beliefs, but of how to defend them without sounding cruel. Harold redirected. Let's shift slightly. Congresswoman Crockett, how do you see public perception affecting reform? Crockett exhaled, grounding herself again. People think reform means weakness, she said. That asking why is the same as excusing. But reform is about precision. It's about saying, this system was built a certain way, and if that way is broken for some, then it's broken for all. She paused. And I want to believe Judge Shindlin knows that. It wasn't a jab, it was an offering. But Judy didn't take it. Instead, she folded her arms again and spoke to the room. I come from a time where people didn't ask why, as much as they asked, what now? What are you going to do to fix your life? What are you going to do to stay out of trouble? She glanced at Crockett. We didn't have all this talk about root causes. We had expectations. Crockett nodded slowly. And those expectations weren't the same for everyone. She didn't raise her voice. She never had to. She let the silence say what words couldn't. After the panel took a brief break, audience members milled around the lobby. Most were polite, but the conversations weren't neutral. You could hear the divides forming in whispers. She's too soft on crime. No, she's just realistic. Judge Judy tells it like it is. Crockett actually understands what's happening in the streets. Justice needs a backbone. Justice needs a conscience. Back in the green room, Crockett stood alone by the refreshment table, stirring her tea. A young reporter approached, maybe late 20s, notebook in hand. Congresswoman, she asked, do you think Judge Judy disrespected you? Crockett looked up. No. She took a sip. She dismissed me. The reporter nodded, ready to write. Crockett stopped her. But that's not new. I've been dismissed since the day I entered court as a public defender. Dismissed in hearings, dismissed in campaign rooms, dismissed in donor meetings. I've learned something about it. What's that? The reporter asked. Crockett set the cup down. That silence is sometimes the loudest teacher in the room. She smiled, not bitterly, not smugly, just like someone who had long ago accepted that being underestimated is its own kind of power. She turned to leave, but added one last thought over her shoulder. And if you listen long enough, sometimes silence starts to echo. The room returned from break with the air of a theater act, slipping quietly into its second half-polite applause. Shifting seats, whispers faded just in time for the cameras to resume. But something had shifted during the intermission, not on the stage, but in the minds of those watching. Jasmine Crockett had not raised her voice, not once. She hadn't offered a single insult, nor interrupted, nor strayed from fact. And yet, she had made people lean in. She had left a mark not by striking hard, but by holding steady. Judge Judy, on the other hand, returned to her chair with her jaw set. Her blazer had been adjusted, her hair resettled, but her eyes were different, more alert now. Defensive, perhaps. She had weathered tough debates before, but this one was harder to contain. Crockett didn't play the part of the radical she could easily dismiss. She was precise, composed, dangerously soft-spoken. And she wasn't trying to win, she was trying to reveal. Harold Masters, sensing the deepening contrast, glanced at his notes, then up again. We've spoken about sentencing disparities and community impact, but there's a broader issue here too, trust. How do we restore public trust in a system that many feel is not built for them? He looked to Judge Judy. She didn't hesitate. By reminding people that the law is the law, she said, her voice ringing out with a familiar sharpness. You break it, you face consequences. It's not perfect, but it's the best we've got. And it doesn't help to keep blaming the system every time someone doesn't like the outcome. It was classic Judy, blunt, final, the kind of soundbite cable news producers love. Crockett didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned slightly in her chair, looking at the moderator. Can I answer with a question? Harold gestured for her to continue. Crockett turned to Judge Judy. Her tone was as respectful as ever, maybe even gentler than before. Judge Shindlin, she began, in all your years on the bench, did you ever wonder why certain communities kept ending up in your courtroom more than others? It was soft, but the effect was seismic. Judge Judy blinked once, then twice. Her mouth opened slightly as if to respond, but nothing came out right away. She regrouped. Because, she said slowly, those communities commit more crimes. The silence that followed was not accidental. Not a soul in the room moved. Even Harold's pen froze over his notes. And then, Jasmine Crockett tilted her head. That was all. No scoff, no laughter, no raised eyebrow. Just a slight tilt, like she'd just heard something familiar, something she expected, but still couldn't ignore. May I? She asked, her voice now almost whisper level. Harold didn't interrupt. No one did. Jasmine leaned forward, resting her forearms gently on the table between them. That answer, she said, is precisely why we're here. Judge Judy stiffened. Are you implying I'm racist? Crockett shook her head. I'm implying that your answer reflects a belief shaped by years of seeing people after they've already been filtered through a system that never started neutral. She wasn't attacking. She was unpacking. Neighborhoods with more patrol cars produce more arrests. That's math, not morality. Schools with underfunded programs lead to dropouts, not because students are less capable, but because the supports aren't there. These are design flaws, not cultural ones. Judge Judy cut in. And what would you have us do? Stop arresting people because of zip codes? Crockett didn't flinch. No, she replied. I'd ask why the laws we pass seem to land harder in some zip codes than others. Now she sat up straighter. You say justice is blind. I say it squints. The audience stirred again. But this time, the murmurs weren't just about politics. They were about recognition. This didn't sound like theory. This sounded like someone naming things that had gone unnamed for too long. Judge Judy shook her head. You keep talking in abstracts. I'm talking about real people, real crimes, real victims. Crockett met her eyes. So am I. A beat. I'm talking about the black teenager who got 15 years for breaking into a pharmacy to steal diapers. I'm talking about the white college student who got 6 months probation for trafficking Adderall. Both committed crimes. Only one got labeled a danger. Judge Judy leaned back slightly. You can't compare every case. I'm not comparing, Crockett cut in, still calm. I'm identifying patterns. Judy's voice sharpened. Patterns don't mean prejudice. They mean data. But behind every data point is a person who made a choice. Crockett exhaled through her nose. Exactly. So let's talk about who gets the luxury of making bad choices and still being seen as redeemable. There it was. Not a blade. A mirror. Judge Judy's tone turned colder. So what, you want to tear down the entire system? Crockett smiled. No, I want to stop pretending the system wasn't already cracked when we inherited it. Another pause. And then came the moment, the one that would be played over and over again. Judge Judy leaned forward, pointing her index finger across the table. You want to know your problem? She said, her voice hard now. Your generation thinks everything is someone else's fault. You don't want accountability. You want excuses. It landed like a slap. But Crockett didn't move. She simply folded her hands again, waited for the room to settle, then spoke. I've been told that before, she said softly. Usually by people who've never been followed through a store, who've never had to teach their nephew how to stay alive during a traffic stop, who've never stood next to a mother as her 19-year-old son gets 30 years for carrying pills that some suburban kids pop at house parties without consequence. She paused, then looked directly at Judge Judy. Accountability is not the problem, Judge Shinlin. The selective application of it is. The audience, so quiet until now, shifted audibly. The energy changed. Something cracked, not in Crockett's voice, but in the armor across the table. Judge Judy blinked again, slower this time. She looked toward Harold, as if asking for a lifeline. But Crockett wasn't finished. I was trained to argue in courtrooms where no one clapped, where every sentence could change a life. I don't do this for applause. I do it because I've seen what happens when no one questions the assumptions baked into the system. She leaned back, and when someone finally does, the response is always the same. Don't make it about race. Don't make it about poverty. Don't make it political. But if we don't name the wound, we can't heal it. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the camera operators, normally robotic in movement, stood still. Harold finally cleared his throat. We're going to transition into closing statements. But no one heard him. They were still listening to the echo of Jasmine Crockett's voice. And Judge Judy Sharp, unshakable, dominant for decades, in a silence she couldn't cut through. The curtain had slipped. Not because someone tore it down, but because someone quietly asked a question that had no safe answer. And the room would never be the same again. When Harold Masters announced the transition into closing statements, it was more of a lifeline than a format. But neither woman moved to deliver one. Because in that room, the closing had already begun quietly, deliberately, before anyone realized they were witnessing it. And Jasmine Crockett wasn't going to raise her voice to make a point. She already had the floor, not because someone gave it to her, but because the silence had. She sat still, calm, her hands folded over her notebook as if she were still waiting her turn. But when she looked up, eyes sharp, voice soft, there was no mistaking it. She had decided it was time. Judge Shinlin, she began, you've built a legacy. No one here questions that. You've ruled on thousands of cases. You've given your life to what you believe is justice. But today, she paused, just long enough for the air to settle again. You showed us something else. You showed us how dangerous legacy can be when it refuses to evolve. Judge Judy sat up straighter. The line landed, not like a punch, but like a needle, precise, almost painless in the moment, but impossible to ignore later. Crockett continued, voice still low. I want to walk you through something. Not an argument. A reflection. She opened her notebook but didn't look down at it. The pages were irrelevant. This was coming from memory. You say justice is about consequences. I agree. But only if those consequences are rooted in equal conditions. Only if they're not written by fear, policed by bias, and carried out through laws that punish not just what people do, but where they come from, how they speak, how they look. She met Judy's eyes, not confrontationally, but with the gaze of someone tired of speaking gently into voids. You see, people after the system catches them. I saw them before it ever gave them a chance. And then she laid the first brick. In 1986, Congress passed the Anti-Drug Abuse Act. It created a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. Crack, used more often in black communities, carried far harsher penalties. That wasn't because one drug was more dangerous. It was political. It was strategic, and it devastated an entire generation. She held, "Those weren't bad choices, Judge. Those were targeted consequences." Judy didn't speak. Her face remained tight, but something in her posture pulled back, just slightly, as if the air around her had thickened. Crockett laid the second brick. In 1994, the crime bill expanded mandatory minimums. It incentivized states to build more prisons. It funded the same zero-tolerance policies that led to 12-year-olds being tried as adults. We called it justice, but now even the architects of that bill admit its harm. She paused again, letting the words breathe. "You say statistics can be manipulated. Maybe. But here are some you can't ignore." She counted with her fingers, not for emphasis, but for clarity. 1. Black Americans make up 13% of the U.S. population, but nearly 40% of the incarcerated. 2. Sentencing for black men is, on average, 19% longer than for white men committing the same crimes. 3. Police are more likely to stop, search, and use force on people of color even when no contraband is found. That's not coincidence. That's design. She let the final phrase hang. Judge Judy shifted again. Not enough to break her image, but enough for cameras to catch it. Crockett leaned forward, not to intimidate, but to bring the truth closer. "You said earlier that you've seen every kind of defendant, and I believe you. But did you ever ask why some defendants never showed up at all?" Judy blinked. Crockett didn't wait. "I'm talking about the CEOs who committed wage theft and got settlements, not jail time. The hedge fund managers who ruined lives and got golden parachutes. The cops who falsified reports and were moved to desk jobs. Where were their consequences?" She didn't need to raise her voice. The accumulation did the work for her. Brick by brick. This isn't about whether crime should have consequences. It's about whether justice has standards. Judge Judy finally responded, her voice quieter now. "You're painting with a wide brush. You think I didn't care about fairness?" Crockett shook her head, gently. "I think you believed in the system so much, you stopped questioning who it served best." That line landed harder than anything she'd said all day. The audience didn't gasp. They simply froze. And Crockett continued, not out of spite, but because silence deserved honesty. "I've stood beside kids who committed the same crimes as their wealthier counterparts, but faced triple the punishment because they didn't have the right lawyer, or the right skin, or the right zip code." She looked down briefly, then back up. "And I've watched good people, justify that with words like tough love or sending a message. But all that message ever said was, 'You don't matter the same.'" Judge Judy stared forward now, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Crockett lowered her voice further. "You told me I don't understand justice because I've only been in Congress a short time." She smiled, not out of pettiness, but as if she were finally letting go of a weight. "But you forget I spent years in courtrooms you've never stepped into, rooms where justice didn't wear robes or command cameras. It wore resignation, fear, handcuffs so tight they left bruises. And in those rooms, I saw the other side of your consequences." Then came the line that would travel further than any meme. "You sat on a bench and processed cases. I stood beside people and carried their names into a system that never meant to remember them." The words weren't cruel. They were careful. And yet they cut deeper than rage ever could. Judge Judy opened her mouth, but no sound came. She looked not angry, but unsure for the first time, perhaps in years. Crockett continued, "You told me we need accountability. I agree. So let's start here." She gestured broadly, as if to the entire institution. "Let's hold accountable the policies that locked up parents, but not the manufacturers who flooded neighborhoods with opioids. Let's hold accountable the judges who sentenced children as adults and the prosecutors who hid evidence. Let's hold accountable the idea that toughness is a substitute for understanding." Then she paused, and for the first time she looked tired, not exhausted, worn, because carrying the truth for too long without being heard has a weight. You called my voice a product of theory. But every word I've spoken here was carved from real stories, real loss, real silence. And then softly she delivered the final brick. You've made a career of speaking last, of shutting people down with a phrase or a stare, and that kind of certainty made for good television, but it doesn't make for good justice. She stood now, not for drama, but because the moment demanded elevation. And today, just today, I wanted to show you that justice doesn't always need to be loud. The entire room stood still. No music, no applause, just the weight of what had been said. Judge Judy sat motionless, her gaze cast downward. And Crockett? She picked up her notebook, tucked a pen into its spine, and said one last thing. You can keep the last word. Then she left the stage. The stage emptied slowly. Crockett didn't look back as she walked off. She didn't need to. The silence that trailed her footsteps was not hollow, it was full. Full of things finally said. Full of truths that had waited too long to find a microphone. Behind her, Judge Judy remained seated, staring not at the audience, but at the table. Her hand traced an invisible line on the wood, back and forth, as if trying to draw order from the moment. Harold Masters attempted to regain composure. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us for today's National Dialogue on American Justice. But no one heard the closing remarks. Not really, because the room had already heard what it came for, and no one would forget it. That evening, the footage aired in full on national television. The town hall, expected to draw modest viewership, was suddenly leading every news cycle. But it wasn't the discussion about crime statistics or policy reform that gripped the publicist was what hadn't been scripted. The implosion of legacy under the weight of unflinching truth. Clips flooded social media before the credits finished rolling. The most viral? Not the statistics, not the confrontation, but the moment Jasmine Crockett looked across the table and said, "You sat on a bench and processed cases. I stood beside people and carried their names into a system that never meant to remember them." That one line was clipped, subtitled, stitched into montages, played over soft piano music, and used by educators, activists, even corporate trainers, and not because it was dramatic, because it was undeniable. By morning, Room That Never Forgot trended across platforms. Think pieces poured in. The Atlantic ran a piece titled, "Not Every Gavel Deserves the Last Word." The New Yorker followed with, "Crockett's Calm, a blueprint for modern courage." Even the Wall Street Journal, rarely one to praise progressive voices, published a headline that read, "Facts, Composure, and a Room Silenced. The Power of Political Precision." But the most remarkable reaction didn't come from politicians or journalists. It came from people who had been inside that system. Public defenders across the country began writing about the moment. Many said they felt seen in a way they never had. "I've sat in courtrooms my whole career, feeling like a translator in a room where no one speaks the truth," one wrote. "Yesterday, Crockett didn't translate. She confronted." Another added, "She didn't dismantle Judge Judy to win an argument. She did it to remind us what justice looks like when it remembers people." At Howard University School of Law, Professor Darian Moore canceled his lecture the next morning. Instead, he played the full town hall for his class and told them, "Watch not what she says, watch what she chooses not to say. That's power." In Ohio, a local DA, who had once proudly modeled his approach on Judge Judy, quietly removed a framed quote of hers from his office. "I still believe in accountability," he said to a reporter, "but I'm rethinking who we've let define what that word means." Judge Judy's camp released a statement within 48 hours. "She respects all viewpoints and is proud of her record," it read. The discussion was spirited, and while she may disagree on certain points, she values the chance to engage. It was polite, strategic, but it didn't matter. Because for once, the voice that carried wasn't hers. And for the first time in decades, she wasn't the closing argument. Back in Philadelphia, the hall returned to quiet. Constitution Hall had hosted generations of discourse founding fathers, presidents, legal scholars. But that night, the staff said it felt different. Almost reverent. One janitor, working the early shift the next day, found something left behind. On the moderator's podium, tucked beneath a microphone, was a folded piece of paper, a page torn from a notebook. On it were only 7 words, written in tight cursive. Justice doesn't always need to be loud. He placed it in the lost and found, but no one came to claim it. Maybe no one had to. A week later, Jasmine Crockett sat on the steps of her district office in Dallas. No cameras, no statements, just a coffee, and the same worn leather notebook she'd carried during the town hall. Her assistant walked up with an envelope. "Another one from D.C.," she said. "Senator Booker sent a note. And," she hesitated, "so did Senator Collins." Crockett raised her eyebrows. Her assistant nodded. "They both said the same thing. We heard you." Jasmine didn't say anything right away. She simply flipped open her notebook to the same page where she'd once scribbled talking points. Now, there were just quotes. From mothers? From kids? From people she'd defended who'd never been invited to stages, let alone listened to. She underlined one. "A system built to forget can't be fixed by silence." Then she looked up and said quietly, "It's not about who hears me now. It's about who finally feels heard." In Washington, a committee quietly began discussing the possibility of revisiting certain sentencing laws. No press release, no press conference. Just staffers meeting behind closed doors, opening files that had sat untouched for decades. One aide, barely 30, said in a group email, "We don't have to wait for a revolution. We just need to start fixing the parts everyone agrees are broken." And in the subject line, she wrote, "The room that never forgot." 2 months later, the Constitution Hall hosted another event, this time on educational equity. The moderator opened the night with a simple reminder. "This building remembers what is said within it, so speak accordingly." It wasn't in the program, but everyone in the room knew exactly what he meant. That's the thing about echoes. They don't ask for permission. They don't check your title. They don't fade just because the speaker left the stage. They live in the questions we can't shake, in the truths we can't unhear, in the rooms that remember, even when history tries to forget. And in that great wooden hall in Philadelphia, long after the cameras shut off and the chairs were stacked away, one sentence still seemed to float in the rafters, quiet, unflinching, undeniable. Justice doesn't always need to be loud. And once it's been said, it can never be unsaid. Have you ever found yourself in a room where your voice was quieter, not because you lacked something to say, but because the room had already decided what it wanted to hear? Maybe you were overlooked. Maybe your truth was too uncomfortable. Maybe, like Jasmine, you had to carry the weight of silence until the moment came to speak. This story wasn't just about a debate. It was about something far more personal. The quiet power of knowing who you are, even when the world pretends not to see you. And if you've ever felt dismissed, underestimated, or unheard, you're not alone. But here's the truth. Dignity doesn't need to shout. Sometimes, the most lasting impact begins in silence and grows louder through every heart it touches. So if this story moved you, inspired you, or reminded you of your own quiet strength, please take a moment to subscribe, share your thoughts in the comments, and send this episode to someone who may need to hear it. You never know whose silence is waiting for permission to become a voice. As Jasmine reminded us with calm certainty, justice doesn't always need to be loud. See you in the next story. Stay tuned.